Program note. Many biblical stories are disturbing, but this one is particularly so, as it includes a completely unacceptable account of an ethnic cleansing. Listener discretion is advised. Samuel said to Saul, "The Lord sent me to anoint you king over his people Israel. Now, therefore, listen to the words of the Lord. Thus says the Lord of hosts, I will punish the Amalekites for what they did in opposing the Israelites when they came up out of Egypt. Now go and attack Amalek and utterly destroy all that they have. Do not spare them, but kill both man and woman, child and infant, ox and sheep, camel and donkey." So Saul summoned the people and numbered them at Telaim, 200,000 foot soldiers and 10,000 soldiers of Judah. Saul came to the city of the Amalekites and lay in wait in the valley. Saul said to the Kenites, "Go, leave, withdraw from among the Amalekites, or I will destroy you with them. For you showed kindness to all the Israelites when they came up out of Egypt." So the Kenites withdrew from the Amalekites. Saul defeated the Amalekites from Havilah as far as Shur, which is east of Egypt. He took King Agag of the Amalekites alive, but utterly destroyed all the people with the edge of the sword. Saul and the people spared Agag and the best of the sheep and of the cattle and of the fatted calves and the lambs, and all that was valuable, and would not utterly destroy them. All that was despised and worthless, they utterly destroyed. Genocide. Is there really any other word than that for what Samuel demands and what King Saul carries out in that passage? There are many stories in the Bible that recount the committing of such war crimes by the people of Israel. But none of those stories is quite as clear as this one in the 15th chapter of 1 Samuel. In this story, it is made abundantly clear that the order to commit genocide comes directly from God. And when Saul fails to slaughter absolutely everyone and everything, this failure is considered to be absolutely unforgivable. Even worse, it is made clear that the Amalekites are not being wiped out because of anything that they themselves have done, but rather for something that their ancestors did generations before. That is on par with the notion, developed in Christian tradition, that it is okay to wipe out the Jews because they are falsely blamed for having killed Christ 2,000 years ago. There is so much going on in this story that scandalizes me. It is the kind of story that I wish were not part of the Bible at all. So, the temptation I feel is to avoid the story altogether. That is perhaps why I have not tackled it in this podcast yet. But this podcast is dedicated to dealing with all of the stories of Scripture, not just the ones I like. And I have found over the years that I have learned a great deal by struggling with the stories that I don't like. So, here goes. This is Retelling the Bible. Episode 10.9, Static on the Line. There were only two things that Samuel hated in this world. People who are intolerant of other people's cultures, and the Amalekites. If you asked him, he couldn't really have said where this hatred for this people came from. You might say that he imbibed it with his mother's milk. For his parents, Elkanah and Hannah, like most Ephraimites, had little love for the people of Amalek. They lived among them in the hill country of Ephraim, but not in great numbers. They were treated as outsiders, and people sneered at them for their strange gods and customs. And then, while he was still young and very impressionable, Samuel had gone to live at the temple in Shiloh, where he dealt with Israelites who came from all over to worship. Since they came to worship the national God of Israel, patriotism was often on display there. So, racist jokes and stories about other ethnic groups were always popular, and the Amalekites were the frequent butt of such jokes. How many Israelite babies does an Amalekite have to kill to fill an oil lamp? That sort of thing. The answer to that one, by the way, was all of them. Hey, I never said the jokes were funny. And then, of course, there were the stories that Samuel was told by Eli and his sons. Stories about how, in ages long past, the Amalekites tried to stop the people of Israel from getting a land of their own, but that Yahweh had defeated them. Samuel had been so young, and living alone in the temple, had been so vulnerable in his youth, that he had simply absorbed all of these attitudes towards Amalekites without even questioning them. And yet, he had also encountered his God, Yahweh, in that place. God had spoken to him in undeniable ways through the ark, a divine chest that was kept in that place. This experience opened his mind to many new ideas and gave him key insights. It had also given him the courage to challenge some of the things that he saw happening in the temple complex. And yet, Samuel, the boy who was experiencing God in these powerful ways, did not cease to be an Ephraimite boy who was formed by his upbringing and his culture. And then the crisis had come. Eli, who had led the nation as priest and judge, had died suddenly. His sons, Hophni and Phinehas, who turned out to be worse than worthless, had been killed in battle. Even the ark, this object that had allowed Samuel to hear the word of Yahweh in the first place, had been taken by the enemy. Suddenly, though he was still little more than a child, Samuel was thrust into a position of leadership over a collection of tribes that were in deep crisis and surrounded by enemies on every side. Should we be surprised if he came out of that whole experience a bit traumatized? Samuel was able to rally the tribes to counter some of the threats that they faced. He won a decisive victory over the Philistines at Ebenezer. That particular threat was neutralized, at least for a while. But Samuel did not feel any safer. He felt certain that they were still surrounded by many enemies, and that they would soon have to deal with them all. In his role as prophet, Samuel continually sought the word of Yahweh. In his youth, he had received oracles from Yahweh by meditating and praying before the ark that had been kept at the temple in Shiloh. But then it was lost. So Samuel had to find other ways to seek the word of Yahweh. Following old traditions, he sought for prophetic messages using music and dancing. Certain herbs could also be useful. But in all of this, Samuel never stopped being the man that he was. When he lost himself in prophetic ecstasy, he still carried his own prejudices and fears with him. When he received his oracles, there were surely many ways in which Yahweh led him to new thoughts and ideas. But such messages still came into a mind that was already infected with certain hatreds, and none of them more potent than his animosity towards all things Amalekite. Years went by. Before he knew it, Samuel was old, and the people were beginning to think about a future without him. And apparently they didn't want his sons to lead them. In fact, they didn't even want someone like him. They wanted something new. A king. Samuel took this as a personal affront. It seemed a foolish thing to do as well. He did not think it wise to entrust so much power to one man. But there were things that a king could do that Samuel had never been able to do. A king could maintain a permanent war band to bolster and train the tribal militia. And, given the troubled times that they were living through, this seemed to be a necessity. And so, Samuel reluctantly agreed and anointed a king for them. The new king, Saul, had had his work cut out for him. But he had fought off some dangerous enemies and created a certain sense of security. But Samuel continued to worry and fear for the future of the nation. He continued to seek the word of Yahweh to know how to protect the nation against their many enemies. One day, in his prophetic ecstasy, the word that he had long sought finally arrived. Apparently, Yahweh had finally agreed that it was time to do something about the Amalekite problem. Samuel sent messengers to call the king to him. And Saul was not afraid to admit that Samuel scared the chara out of him. He set out immediately, as soon as he received the summons. When he arrived, Samuel gave him the message. Yahweh sent me to anoint you king over his people Israel. Now therefore listen to the words of Yahweh, he intoned. Thus says Yahweh Tzevaot, I will punish the Amalekites for what they did in opposing the Israelites when they came up out of Egypt. Now go and attack Amalek and utterly destroy all that they have. Do not spare them, but kill both man and woman, child and infant, ox and sheep, camel and donkey. Saul had grown up in the territory of Benjamin, where he had never encountered many Amalekites. The Benjaminites had never developed the kind of prejudice about them that was common further north. They were just another people living in the land, and if they didn't bother you, there really was no reason to bother them. So Saul didn't really understand where Samuel's hatred was coming from. It didn't make any sense to him. Hatred, honestly, rarely does make much sense. But at the same time, he was not about to push back against what the prophet said. Saul owed his very position to the belief held among all the people that Samuel spoke for Yahweh. If Saul questioned the message from Samuel today, that would open the door for someone to question what Samuel had said when he anointed Saul as king. That was a can of worms that Saul was not willing to open. And so, Saul had no choice. He called up his war band, he raised a militia, and he headed off to ambush the Amalekites. But he couldn't have said that his heart was truly in it. The campaign was brutal. Saul's warriors descended upon the main city, the towns, and the villages of the Amalekites. When the men of Amalek formed up in their units to oppose them, that they understood. They attacked and killed them with a good will, because that's what warriors do. But once the defenders had been eliminated, it was very different. Samuel had been clear that this was to be a campaign of herem. That meant not only that the fighting strength of the people had to be eliminated, the very idea of them had to go. The entire people were to be devoted to Yahweh, which meant devoted to utter destruction. So, how did Saul's men feel when they had to line up the women and children to slaughter them? How did they feel having to do the same thing to the livestock? Such an idea was common among the nations. Many other kings and war leaders engaged in herem, devoting their enemies to their national gods. But even when warriors carry a deep hatred for the people they are sent to destroy, that can be a very difficult thing to do. It strikes their consciences and makes them question many things. Saul's troops carried little such hatred. They were, to be honest, mostly acting out of fear of Samuel. Many of them were frankly disgusted with what they had to do, though they wouldn't have dared to say it. So, it is perhaps not surprising that Saul's campaign of eradication was less than total. Many civilians inexplicably managed to escape the slaughter, and commanders turned a blind eye to it. Of course, none of that caused the Amalekite survivors to have any sympathy for Saul or his forces. They cursed the name of Saul and any who would come from his house forever. In one village, only one young man survived. As he fled into the hills, he swore by all the gods that one day he would be the one to kill Saul himself and to ensure that his house was destroyed with him. But, hey, it's not like a vow like that ever became a foreshadowing of anything like a future episode of a podcast. Despite his fear of Samuel, Saul could not bring himself to make the slaughter complete. He spared Agag, who was a king like him, and set aside some of the best of the livestock and cattle. Samuel was not impressed. When he came to the camp, he berated Saul in front of all of his men for his failure to carry out his instructions. He took a sword and personally sliced King Agag to pieces before their eyes. Saul had done all of this to preserve his kingdom. But in the end, when Samuel's displeasure was made so clear, his position in the nation was weaker than ever. His kingdom and his power would continue to decline for the rest of his life. And so, in the end, had the people of Israel been made safer? It didn't really seem so. It is enough to make you wonder if anything had corrupted the word of Yahweh that Samuel had given. But it was not as if anyone was going to ask that question in the hearing of the prophet. people like Samuel and Saul are questionable historical figures at best. There is no evidence that they ever existed, apart from the stories in the Bible, and some of what is told there contradicts the archaeological evidence. We also have no evidence for the genocide of the Amalekite people. There is even evidence in the Bible itself that they continued to exist as a people beyond the time of this story. But none of that means that we don't have to deal with the story itself. Whether or not it was actually carried out at that time and by those people, there is no question that such crimes against humanity are part of the biblical story. They are done at the behest of God and of God's prophets, and we need to figure out what to think about that. The God who is revealed in the Bible is a God who cares passionately about a particular people. This God has a covenant with them, has pledged to preserve their well-being. It makes sense, therefore, that such a God would care about their defense and the threats represented by their enemies. But does that mean that God would endorse genocide against those enemies? The Bible certainly assumes that, as is made plain in many a story or prophetic pronouncement. But, of course, that was the basic understanding of what gods did for their people in the ancient world. The act of devoting an enemy to destruction for the glory of your national deity was generally accepted. It showed that you loved your God, and the victory that allowed you to do it showed you that your God loved you. So, it is not in the least surprising that the ancient people of Israel expected that their God would show them love in the same way. But I don't necessarily think that that means that they were right. Whatever messages they may have received from their God, those messages were filtered through their expectations, and also through the prejudices, hatred, and biases that they carried within them. People have always had spiritual experiences. They have received inspiration and deep insights that they believed came from divine origins. That people have experienced such things, both in ancient times and today, is undeniable. Whether such things actually do come from God is another question, and not something that can be proven. But if such experiences do come from God, that does not mean that the transmission has ever been perfect. There is always static on the line. But surely that is not because God is a bad communicator. The static must be on the receiving end of the line, because even when we are doing our best at listening for the word of the Lord, we don't cease to be human. Oh, we may do our best to put everything else out of our mind and focus only on the message we are receiving. I'm sure that was something that the ancient prophets of Israel did. But we can never entirely let go of our human assumptions about the world and how it works. We especially have a hard time setting aside our prejudices and the racism and hatred that they engender. So, Samuel, if he existed, may well have received messages from his God about how to protect his people from their many enemies. God may have even had concerns about the people of Amalek. But I am also certain that the transmissions of God's concerns were imperfect. I would not be at all surprised if Samuel brought his own concerns and prejudices to the conversation, and that influenced the word that he proclaimed to Saul. At least, that is how I have come to think about this disturbing story. What are your thoughts? How do you struggle with this story that is a part of our Bible? That is it for this episode of Retelling the Bible. Join us again in 2 weeks' time for another episode. Make sure to rate and review and to share this podcast with someone else. The theme music for the podcast is Ada by Kevin MacLeod, and the mood music for this episode was Claire de Lune. Cello Improvisation by Sasha End. The music is licensed in the Creative Commons and can be found at incompetech.com and at nd.app, respectively. You can contact me on Bluesky at Retelling the Bible, on the Facebook page Retelling the Bible. Show notes have been posted at retellingthebible.wordpress.com. Thanks once more to my Patreon supporters for their generous support. Go to patreon.com/retellingthebible to join them in supporting this podcast. This is Retelling the Bible, and I have been your storyteller, W. Scott McCandless.